Welcome to Storycomic Presents, where we interview amazing storytellers and artists. This is episode 64. I am your host, Barney Smith of storycomic.com. And we're excited to have back with us the internationally acclaimed cartoonist and educator, Marek Bennett. Marek, how are you doing?
Oh, could be worse. How are you?
You know what? It's still living the dream. You know, we're still here. So, and before we went live, before we went on the air, we're just talking about that. You were on last year, I think like episode 5 or 6 or so, and we were kind of prep and said, hey, this coronavirus thing, which it's gonna be weird. We're gonna have to close the schools for a couple of weeks, or. And here we are. We're pushing forward, and we're already a year ahead of a year into it, and we're still here
for now.
Yeah.
I was thinking about that. Like, what a moment. I think about that probably every day. That moment of a year ago, this week or next week. I was in the middle of a school residency nearby here, and I remember saying something along the lines to you of like, the school might be closed next week, and they say it might even last till the end of March, which is just unbelievable. But who knows? We'll see. And fast forward, I like to think of myself as like living in the future. Here we are in this dystopic future that none of us could have imagined. But what would you tell yourself last year? If you could go back and take yourself by the collar and be like, listen, self,
I was like, oh, sweet summer child, if only you know what you're to expect. Yeah.
Get real, self.
And we talked about last year, you were promoting your Kickstarter that we talked about. And here it is. I have a copy of it in my hand. Yeah. And so just do a recap. How did that go? How did the Kickstarter? Obviously, it was funded because I have a copy of the book in my hand.
Yeah.
How did that go for you? Was it everything that you expected? Was there any hiccups that you saw throughout the process, or?
It was a pretty straightforward project. I mean, it was my sketchbook from that trip to Sharjah, United Arab Emirates, and
right.
I mean, there was a lot of editing. I spent more time editing it than I did drawing it. I was done drawing it within a couple weeks, and then I spent the next 5 months editing it. And the Kickstarter was kind of near the end of that process, so there wasn't much left to do. I kept it purposefully, like I kept my expectations low and my goal small, and then and thankfully people backed it, and then I had a book that was coming out in the middle of the pandemic. So that was interesting. Like I said, could be worse,
Right. Yeah. And we'll talk about it a bit. You have lots of projects that you've been working on and you've lined up, and you're also a part of the and you're also one of the artists member of the Most Costly Journey.
Mm-hmm.
Did you want to just and this just got funded from Kickstarter, correct?
Technically, it was a couple months ago.
Okay.
But we're just finishing up the book now. Yeah.
Okay.
The artwork has been done actually for a couple of years, and this book has just been. It's a beautiful thing to have 15, 16 plus artists involved in it and 20 plus storytellers. I've never worked on a book, with this many contributors, not even to mention all the clinicians and nurses and translators and all the people involved. But partly because of that, it even though the artwork was done, there's just a lot of moving parts, a lot of editing to do, a lot of shaping the book. So it's been, we thought we'd have it done by January. It's finally coming together now, and we're just like tightening a couple screws and bolts before we send it out.
So you've worked on anthologies with other people. You've also done your own Kickstarters on your own. What would you see as the difference between working on something that is anthology based as your expectations and work as compared to doing something on your own? What are some of the pros and cons of both?
Well, other anthologies I've been in, I've been a contributor. So I've I send in my 3 or 10 pages, and then several months later you get this big book back, and you're like, oh, let's see what Barney did in that one. And it's an exciting moment. And this is kind of the opposite. It's like we've had that set of covers. Those are the covers of the sort of in-house self-printed mini comics that the clinic was putting out and distributing around the migrant community. These are all, each one is a specific story or collection of stories told by migrant farm workers in Vermont, most of whom are Latino American, and most of whom are undocumented.
Right.
So the storytellers work closely with an artist who's connected in some way to New England. Most of the artists are from Vermont or in Vermont or were in Vermont at the time. So there's that geographical connection. And so then the idea was just there's a certain kind of medicine in just telling your story and being heard. So just on the storyteller level, working with somebody to really get down the details and represent it in comics form is a deeply healing process. These are stories of trauma, stories of struggle, stories of coping and victory and trials.
Right.
So, and just on that level, telling your story and working with somebody to work through it is incredibly healing. And then sharing it with your community is healing. And then reading somebody else's story that reflects and connects with yours is healing. And then as an artist coming from outside the migrant farm worker community, it's incredibly eye-opening to read each story and be like, oh my gosh, that I can connect to that story. We have something in common. Where before reading that story, my or one's only contact with the migrant community was hearing some negative news story about undocumented migration.
Right.
And I always say, if you're sipping a glass of milk or coffee with cream in it, or eating some pizza with cheese on it, while reading these stories, you're consuming the products that these storytellers produce or play a role in producing. And New England's dairy industry runs on their life experiences. Partly.
Right. You see it. So the genre of like the biography, as you pointed out, this one here is kind of a contemporary biography. You do some autobiographical work as well, where you portray yourself as a rabbit, and we talked about that last year. But you also have Freeman Colby, which is a biography that's historical. Have any of those separate projects has been more successful because of the information or some of the education you got from previous biography projects?
Yeah, they all. That's interesting. They all build on each other. Whether you intend them to or not. I'll give you an example of that. We'll edit out the part where I roamed around on my desk frantically trying to find something. Well, I'll just describe it to you and I can share it with you later. So I started like the Freeman Colby books. Backing up. So like autobio, I think, is the easiest place to start. Like, what happened to you today? Okay, draw 3 or 4 boxes, draw it as a comic. What do you notice? Like the experience changes when you draw it, because you say, well, I'm not going to include the thing that happened in the background or this part that doesn't contribute to the story. Well, what is the story? It's a creative construction that you're making, right? The conceit is like, it's autobio, it's nonfiction. Yeah, but it's constructed, it's art, right? It's something that it's art in the artificial sense, not in a pejorative way, but it's something you put together and present it to yourself or to the page or to a reader. And that's autobio. I think it's an inherently creative process to say, who am I? That's what really this Sharjah sketchbook kind of, my favorite parts of that book are all about that. Why do you draw yourself as a rabbit? Why are you drawing me as a cat or something? Well, because you said you liked cats, and And that tells me something about your heart. I think those were my favorite parts of the book, where we kind of question what we're doing when we draw ourselves.
Right.
And that's a very ancient thing. You go back into cave paintings, and the little animal figures in the oldest cave paintings are like human figures with ears and tails and snouts. In those old Indonesian cave paintings, it's something people have been doing, and they're hunters. Autobio cartooning,
Right.
And well, maybe it was a part of a religious ceremony. Well, a lot of people, it's kind of a religious ceremony to read the Sunday comics in the paper every week. If you're my generation, that was a big part of Sunday morning, is getting those comics. As big as going to church or something like that for me. And then, like, doing autobio, I was traveling around in Slovakia and doing like family stories, and that quickly becomes community and quickly becomes region. And you realize, oh, now I'm researching history. I came back to New England and thought, why have I never done this? Why have I never said, I'm a cartoonist? Who am I? What am I drawing here? Why do I have to go somewhere else to have that experience of digging into the ground beneath my feet? So that's what became Freeman Colby, really, is finding an old diary, that was archived. I didn't find it, but finding it in an old box, and then starting to draw this series of graphic novels. And life happens as you're drawing. It takes a couple of years to do a 500-page book. So while that's happening, I've also been working on the El Viaje project, which is the migrant farm worker stories. And I realized, going back to the Civil War stories of Freeman Colby, he's a migrant far from home, just trying to survive, just trying to stay on the right side of the law, but, not get his head blown off in the Civil War. And he's meeting all these people who are migrants, who are refugees from slavery, who are refugees from battles,
right.
Who are wounded refugees from the trauma of war. And so as I'm exploring that, I'm realizing he's not alone there. There's other people who can tell parts of his story that he doesn't want to tell, that he doesn't include in his letters home to his family. And then you question yourself, okay, in my autobio stuff, what am I not telling?
Right.
What am I missing here? That's a piece I tried to ask in that book too. Here I am at a book fair. We're talking to authors. We're talking to artists. We're talking to book lovers. Wait a minute. Who are we not talking to here? What does the guy who drives the taxi cab say? What does the guy, back at the hotel in the kitchen say?
Right.
And just trying to also ask those questions too. I mean, that's very much what El Viaje is about too. What's your story? You're the person who feeds New England, and can't even show your face in town and has to hide out. One wants to plant a garden, so you have to find some spot that's not visible from the road so you can plant a garden with your daughter because you've lived here for 10 years, and
right.
You're still not accepted as a member of the community. Just last summer, I kind of stumbled across a gravestone here in town that was, it's a really remarkable, peculiar gravestone. It's the gravestone of an African-American Revolutionary War veteran. And there's so many. I'll send you a link to the project and what I've posted of it. His name was Jeremiah Crocker, and it just says on the gravestone, died, I think July 14th, 1836, age about 100 years. Just thinking, just reading that gravestone, it's like the teaser on the back of a novel or graphic novel.
Right.
And just reading that, I just realized there's so much I don't know about my own hometown here in New Hampshire.
Right.
I had no idea. His name, I found his name was not included in the genealogies in the town history. It was not included on the Revolutionary War Memorial in town. And yet he served 4 tours of duty over the course of the war, was enslaved in Massachusetts, arrived in this town before or right around the time the first bridge was built, saw this town go from nothing to a thriving early 19th century village.
Right.
and managed to become so much a part of town that when he died, they made him a gravestone. They wrote who he was on it. That's the only reason he survives to history, is because he was such a part of town. And yet he's like written out of so much of the history. His story was not told, and people don't know who he is. And he died right around 1836, is just a couple years before Freeman Colby was born. So Freeman Colby was born into this town that no longer had this amazing oral history from this African-American Revolutionary War veteran. And the identity of the town was changing. And I realized, like, finding that and finding Jeremiah Crocker's story from the 1700s into the 1800s, and thinking of what an integral part of this town he was, and that he could just disappear so quickly then because of that. Who are you? What stories are you telling? What stories are you not telling? Like, the town also goes through that process. And they went through that process within Freeman Colby's lifetime. So by the time he goes off to fight the Civil War, the way he writes his letters, you can see he has very little sense of what slavery was, what racism was. He just doesn't have any vocabulary or understanding of it. And it really, I found that, of course, after doing 2 volumes of Freeman Colby's story. So I'm now taking that knowledge and that understanding and working it into volume 3, because Freeman Colby he's learning as he goes too. And that knowing that deep hidden layer of his own town's history and my own town's history enables me to kind of question that when he's telling his own story, and add those layers in as I work.
Right. So because you are working on a volume 3 of Freeman Colby. So the gentleman that you mentioned before, is that going to be like a prequel to Freeman Colby? Are you thinking about making a book on him as well?
I have, I have a folder right here on my desk that is that work in progress. I have a couple bevies of folders here that are works in progress, and Jeremiah Crocker is one of those. But you know, I don't know, we could talk all evening. I could talk all evening about that project, because when you say, okay, who is Jeremiah Crocker? How did he live in town for over half a century? And then by the time Freeman Colby is a kid, you know, he doesn't show any knowledge of this history of the town. And to realize Jeremiah Crocker had a family, he had kids, they all lived here in town. And yet they kind of disappear from the official history so quickly. That got me thinking, okay, is his family the only family here in town where that happened? Or is it possible, and it turns out there's a whole community here in town, you know, that, and that project quickly became like, okay, what's Jeremiah Crocker's life story, and what were his experiences? What were at least the names of his family? You know, if we can't get their stories, and how could we get some sense of what their life was like? Well, you have to go look at other people's stories, and it turns out every town around here. I found a story of an Indian raid in the French and Indian War, the next town over, and the story is told that this young boy and an enslaved man were going out into the fields, and when they saw a group of Indians coming to raid the town, they ran for help. The boy escaped, but only because the enslaved man distracted the Indians and was shouting and hollering and alerted the whole town, saved the town. Wow. Everybody got into the meeting house. They all looked out there. The enslaved, I'm blanking on his name. They said the enslaved man was captured by the Indians, taken off to Canada, and we never heard from him again. Actually, the kid was captured too, and he was redeemed a couple years later. But the way it's told, it's like, yeah, the Indians, they came and they took our slave. And you think, like, did he go with them? You know, was he captured? Or a lot of people who were captivated up to Canada, when they came to be redeemed, they were like, no, I'm good. I don't want to go back to New England where women don't have any rights, or where they're free. I think I'll stay up here. It's pretty cool up here. So, and that I started turning up all these stories of towns in New Hampshire. Like it's a whole period in 18th century New England history where clearing the land of these towns was done largely by, I don't know about largely, mostly, it was done partly by enslaved people.
Right.
And the deal would be, I have to go up and clear this patch of land and then I'll get my freedom, or clear the land, serve in the Revolutionary War, good service as defined by these people who have economic power. Now I get my freedom. And that they were always working towards freedom, always working towards family. Boom, we're right back on El Viaje. Those are the themes of what people are doing now as they're undocumented in New England.
Right.
Working for family, working for options.
Right. Yeah. And it's amazing how things don't change over a couple hundred years. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So when you talk about your James Crocker, did you have how much of it do you when you're kind of like forming a story that you have to use some creative license on, what, this is going a little slow here, or I need to I got to make sure the reader keeps flipping the pages. How much of that with Freeman Colby or some of your other projects that you take some of that creative freedom, or do you feel like it's more important to stay the course on anything that you find that's only the information that you're able to research?
First thing that comes to mind with Freeman Colby, I have a finite number of letters, finite number of diary pages. And if there are gaps, I go looking in Walt Whitman's notebooks. I go down to I don't go anymore to the Historical Society in Concord, but I love going into the reading room there at New Hampshire Historical Society, and they have a big box of the letters of Nurse Sarah Lowe that I can pull out and be like, what's happening in the ward today, Sarah? And, I can fill in those gaps. And I can go as deep as I want with photographs and artwork. And I can pretty much track down the newspapers they were reading to get a sense of what they knew about the news and the books they were reading if they mention them. But, it's all built around the letters. It's all built around this time-limited narrative of, I went off to the Civil War. And then a year passed, and then another year passed, and then another year passed, and then I was home. Like, that's as deep as you want to go. It's only going to be 3 years. When you take a life like Jeremiah Crocker's life, I think cartooning. I've been thinking about this a lot as defining cartooning with people in different presentations or school residencies. And I always say it's that art form where you leave out more than you put in. I don't know if we talked about this last year.
Yeah. Well, I was just saying, like, working from a diary or letters, you can go as deep as you want, but it's limited. It's 3 years of Freeman Colby's life, right? But looking at a topic like Jeremiah Crocker and what his story tells us about, New England history, United States history, the economics of this 18th and 19th centuries, racism in a small town, and what it tells us about resistance to racism, among the people of town and Jeremiah Crocker's behalf, and on his part. But that leads to other people's stories, that you can't understand that story just as like, he came to town 1780 and then he died 1836. It's not that kind of it's not a travel narrative or a series of actions. It's, again, like, what is the story? How do you tell it? I have a timeline of his life, of the different dates that I've been able to track down or other people have tracked down. He wrote a pension application that lists what he did when, and there are ways to do that, but that's not really the story. I think the story is, okay, we know these little crumbs, and then all the gaps in between we'll never know, because Freeman Colby growing up a white man in 1840s, 1850s, 1860s Henniker, he had access to certain resources. He was able to write down his diary and put it into the historical society. Right? By the early 20th century, it's being archived in paper on a shelf somewhere, or by the mid 20th century. Jeremiah Crocker didn't have access to those systems of archiving his thoughts, his experiences. I don't know if he wrote a diary. I don't know if he could write or read, but he just didn't have like a community that said, what's your story? And we're now going to save this. So we just don't have it in his words, as far as I know.
Right.
So to tell that story, I feel like I have to go to like, okay, where else can we get a few more crumbs? Well, there's this guy from Canterbury named Samson Battis, who also served in the Revolutionary War, also returned to Canterbury, New Hampshire, also is buried in Canterbury, but he's buried with a standard Revolutionary War veteran headstone. It doesn't tell his life story written by the people of town, done in memorial. It's a standard one that you get as part of your pension. And he's not in the graveyard. He's off down the hill over in the woods by some field stones that are also like non-gravestone gravestones of the African-American community of Canterbury. And so I'm like learning his story and then bringing that back to Jeremiah Crocker and saying, well, what does that tell us? How does that like shed light on this story? I think you have to look at it from a lot of different directions, a lot of different angles, a lot of different people's stories.
Right.
The other angle is, I think I mentioned this before, like, what are we not telling? What are we leaving out? Like cartooning is leaving stuff out so that you get to the heart of the story. And there's a marker. I had a picture of it here by my desk and suddenly it's probably fell off the wall. There's a marker nearby, just a couple miles from my house here. That's a nice stone marker that the town put up. And it says, 1763, site of first frame house in Henniker. First, like 2-story house that was not a log cabin. First child born. And I always thought it was an interesting sort of statement of what is the town, because it doesn't mention all the native peoples who were here before 1763. You know, it just mentions this one child being born right as the town was kind of became a town and was chartered as a town and started organizing itself. So the town is not the land. The town is the social group that erects this monument and says first child born in this town, not on this land, but in this town. Well, digging around a little more, I realized you kind of, there's certain clues of whose farm is whose and what site is what. That site is the place where the first enslaved person was brought to town. About 5 years before there was even a town here. This woman was brought here. We don't know her name because it's not in the town history. It just mentions that she was enslaved here in town by that same family. So that marker, like that says first house in town, first baby born in town, first child born in town, does not say first enslaved person in town.
Right.
And that's like, and that's part and parcel with the story of Jeremiah Crocker. Whether they may not have even known each other, you know, but or maybe they were part of a community here in town. I haven't connected their stories, but they're connected in that sense. Like these are stories that were intentionally left out that are the negative space of the story of town, and that tells you an awful lot about the town.
So as basically as the writer of the script and also creating the and the cartoonist of these books, compared to your autobiographical work, where doing these, do you feel as though that you kind of co-own the story, or do you feel like you own the story because you're the one creating the work?
Yeah. Oh, good question. That's something with El Viaje. That's something that we had to sort out, because who's responsible for the artwork? Who's responsible for the story? Whose story is it? If you're collaborating with somebody to draw this comic out, how do you think of it? Is it their story in comics form, or is it a comic based on their story. My approach with Jeremiah Crocker has been, yeah, it's a delicate line to walk, because the more you put into the artwork, back to like leaving details out, the more I put into the artwork, the further it gets from Jeremiah Crocker's story. He's like Freeman Colby. I mean, Freeman Colby, I have no idea what he looked like, right? I don't have any photos of him. Jeremiah Crocker, same thing. I have no photos of him. I don't even know. He's described, actually. There is a description of him, a really wonderful description of him. Very sentimental, but by someone who I think as a child knew him. And actually, it's the only description of somebody in the entire 400-page town history that is told from the point of view of a child.
Oh, wow.
By someone who was a kid before he died. So I think it's actually his memories of sitting on his knee and hearing stories of the Revolutionary War, you know. Wow. But if I try to draw that scene, what am I putting into that scene? What gives me the right to say, well, I think he had a candelabra on the table and a dog by his feet, and you know, but I need to draw that scene. We need to see that scene. Right. But we don't need to see what I imagine into that scene. We need to see the idea of that scene.
Right.
The idea of these kids who identified as white in this small town, when they thought of who is a Revolutionary War soldier, their image of the Revolutionary War was this tall African-American guy in his regimental uniform, which he would wear to every muster day. And he would stand by the flag and by the men, even as an old man, almost 100 years old, right? He would show up at muster day and stand out on the field with the local militia at a time when New England was becoming more and more segregated, and abolitionism was taking off, but also a reaction to it was really setting in. He makes himself visible. He goes to every town event, and he shows up again and again. If you know to read for it in the town history, you're like, there he is. That's him. That's the Major. Right. You know, that was his nickname, and he shows up, and he inserts himself into town history and puts himself there. So it's like he's doing that. I feel like whether it's intentional or not, Jeremiah Crocker was making himself visible, like standing, getting photobombing, being like, nice town, I live here too. nice country, you know, I'm a Revolutionary War. Did I ever tell you about the time I was in the Revolutionary War? You know, yeah. Not in a needy kind of way, in an insistent way. He's like taking all the kids on his knee. The kids all loved him. They loved his stories. He's sharing those stories with a kid who's going to grow up to write the town history book, who's going to record them into that book. And that's transmitted, you know, to, I don't know, a 21st century cartoonist who finds that story and says, this is amazing. How does nobody know about this around here? How did I grow up here in town, never hearing the story of this 100-year-old guy who was enslaved in Massachusetts and then free by the time he came to town and served in the Revolutionary War and like was at every major event in town history for over 50 years. How did I not learn his story? All right, we gotta know this story. But do we need to know like Marek's version of what it looked like? Or do we need to, my goal, I think, is this is a really long answer to your question, I guess. My goal is to stick as close as I can to the primary source. Right. But then step back and say, primary source is a subjective thing. This is something that somebody wrote down at a historical moment for a historical reason. Right. What are their limitations? What can we say, knowing that, like, what's missing from this primary source? Okay, let's go grab something to fill that hole, but be clear that we're grabbing something to fill that hole.
Right. And how much are you being like consciously aware that you might be like inferring your own reaction to if you were there at the time, or do you feel as though that do you put yourself into the story, or do you feel as though that you kind of want to, as much as possible, be objectively speaking, to feel that you are witnessing it or being a part of it? How would you compare that? Or
yeah, I think with with Freeman Colby, I've made an intentional. The first book is all his diary. The words are all his. And if I had to change them a little for readability, I put a little mark under the panel so you could always tell. And if you want to, you can go to the Historical Society, look up his diary and check, and you'll see like, oh, Marek inserted a comma there, so it read better. Just minor little details. But with volume 2, I just couldn't do that because this is 1863. You know, the war has changed completely. They're marching into Virginia. He's encountering slavery firsthand. He's not writing in his letters and his diary entries what's really going on, what he's really seeing. You know, he's writing home to his little sisters at home. He's not going to tell the actual story of what it's like to be in a hospital ward after a battle, or what people are coming across the lines, escaping from slavery, and coming and telling stories of their families still back there on the plantations. It's intense stuff. And yet so he's not telling that. So I've got to fill that in. But I want you always to know it's no longer, I put little marks at the bottom of the page so you know the sources. And then I have a whole section in the back that walks through the different sources and says, here's why I included her story here at this point in the book. Here's why I think like they never met, but she's telling a part that he would have seen if he had been in the city at that time. So I put her in there and I put him in there so that you could understand the different sides of the scenes. So I want that to be visible. I want that to be part of the storytelling.
You are presently, if anybody's into, and check out Marek's Patreon page. He's got some great stuff on here. So you are now you're work in progress on volume 3 of Freeman Colby. What can your readers expect from volume 3? That is it the continuing the story? There's new action and adventure. I don't know what to call it for like compared.
Well, it's 1864. So if you know your Civil War history, you know that Freeman Colby's returning to active duty in late April 1864. He's about to go through. He's about to be directly involved in some of the most intense, bloody combat North America has ever seen. You know, the Wilderness, Spotsylvania. He wasn't at Cold Harbor, but he was, nearby. And then the Siege of Petersburg, and the Siege of Richmond. He comes and goes through all that in his letters, and he shares a couple details in his letters, but I really have to go into other people's accounts, and it's intense stuff.
Right.
And the Battle of the Crater happens. They were posted nearby. So what I'm doing, my approach is, in volume 2, it really fragmented because Freeman Colby spent a good part of 1863 in the hospital. So I follow the other guy from Henniker, Jonas Bacon, his friend, his childhood friend and neighbor. They're both in the same unit. So I follow Jonas Bacon through a good part of the book as he's on his own suddenly in this regiment marching into Virginia. And then I go back and follow Freeman Colby in the hospital, but I have to do that through a nurse's letter, Sarah Lowe. And also Walt Whitman is volunteering at the same time in the hospitals, spending all his free time there. So he's in there too. And volume 3 is really it's like parallel tracks. It's going to follow all of them. Freeman Colby, you can see on that page, I do this on the Patreon. I kind of build the book as we go from this one central post. So you can always go back to that post and find the latest stuff. And in this case, it's tracked. So you can find what's going on in Sarah Lowe's narrative and what's going on in Walt Whitman's narrative, and what's going on in Freeman Colby's narrative. And I'm also sticking with a couple of characters who have escaped from slavery and come across the lines, one of whom is enlisting in the 23rd U.S. Colored Troops, as they were called, an African-American regiment. And they'll show up later at the Siege of Petersburg. So these tracks kind of separate and then come back together. And while I can't can't show that some of them I can't show that they were actually in the same time at the same place. I know by their letters they were like at least in the same town on the same dates, so they would have had some common experience. And I'm upfront about that in the graphic novel. My only other option, I briefly considered doing these books and just kind of blacking out between the letters and being like, okay, here's Freeman Colby's letter from June. Next letter is September. Maybe I'll just have a little paragraph saying here are the major historical events going on, and now here's the next thing we know. And that would have been more historically accurate in a small sense, but it's such a challenge, and it's so fun to try to figure out how can I tell these people's stories respectfully and represent their stories the way I think they would feel like I think the more detail, the more representational you get in the artwork. Like I said, the further you get from what actually happened, because I don't know what actually happened. Right. So my approach is to draw as little as possible and get as close as possible to exactly what I think happened based on, 3 or 4 sources.
So how do you, and I don't think we talked about this last year. How do you do that? Do you actually write out an entire script, or do you start with notes? So how does this work as you're working on this? Do you script everything out and then sketch and then ink?
Well,
how's your process?
The script is the letter. So I have transcripts of the letters right here. This one happens to be open to Freeman Colby's letter from Carver Hospital, April 1st, 1864. So it's a transcript of the letter. And I just go through that and I mark it up to divide it up into the big ideas.
Okay.
And usually like each paragraph becomes a page unless it starts to live and breathe and tell a story, and then it might become 2 or 3 pages. But I look at a paragraph or so or a part of the story, and if it's, you divide it up and you kind of find the rhythm of the story. So if it's like 6 ideas or 6 actions, I might do 6 or 8 panels, or 6 panels, one of them a big panel and then some small panels under it, however you want to emphasize and create a rhythm to the storytelling. So the pages are all there. It's like a grid approach. The text all comes directly out of that letter. In this case, like here, he's writing home about being in the hospital tent in camp and the lice that they found crawling all over themselves, and because they're not thinking, they're not like trying to make a movie. They're not trying to write a novel. They're just trying to share some sense of what the experience was with people they care about, in all these letters and diary entries. So I think because of that, you get especially from letters, you get a really honest take on what's happening today.
Right.
You don't get like 3 years later, what's the story I want to tell about my time in the Civil War? You get, here's what's going on right now and how I feel about it.
Like there's that taking away that sense of nostalgia. Because if you look back, if you always look back on your memories, there is a sense of nostalgia about it. But like you say, this is like happening right now. Do you? So oh, go ahead.
Just because you mentioned that, and I just thought of something with some of their with the regimental history that I have, not the letters, but I can supplement the letters with the regimental history, which collects a lot of different people's journals and diaries and recollections. But there's this interesting thing that happens in the regimental history where when they go into combat, they'll switch to present tense sometimes. It's as if they're like telling the story and writing it, and it starts happening right then, and they're talking in the present tense instead of saying, here's what we did. So that tells me a lot that I change. There's parts of the book where I don't have them tell the story. I just leave the words out and show what's happening.
Right.
And that's where I'm most tentative too, because that's where I'm doing the most, like Marek making a comic, including myself as the cartoonist. Oh, wouldn't this look cool? But I'm trying to do that based on what they say.
So how far along are you on volume 3 now?
About 200 pages in. It's been, I keep a chart each month of pages I'm working on, and it's going very slowly. For some reason, the past year, it's been very hard to finish any projects. So it's been going slowly, but I've just been patient with that because I'm like researching Jeremiah Crocker, and I'm getting back into teaching now that the schools are starting to schedule things again. And I just know that everything that happens between now and when that book is done is essential learning for what the book's going to be.
Right.
So I'm not, there's a time to push yourself and a time to be patient. And I'm kind of in a pushy patient mode. I know
do you have a deadline that you're giving yourself for this book?
If you asked me a year ago, I would have said I'll definitely have it by spring 2021. But a year ago, we were talking about schools being closed for 2 weeks, maybe.
Right.
So yeah, it'll be done when it's done. But at some point, once I wrap up the stuff I'm working on now, I will start cracking the whip on that. And what I do with that is I just set a goal based on like my teaching schedule and other projects. And I'll just say, okay, I'm going to do, a page a day or 2 pages a day. For most of volume 2, I set a goal of 3 pages a day and pretty much stuck to it. I averaged about 2 pages a day over the year and a half I was working on it.
So another historical thing you're working on, do you want to talk to us a bit about the stories of Daisy Turner?
Yeah, that's really exciting. We just had a meeting on that. I probably shouldn't try to recall specifics, but it should be out as a graphic novel, another anthology through Vermont Folklife Center, and they're putting it together for this, hopefully in the next few months. It's probably bad luck to give a target date. Hopefully in the next few months, hopefully this year, let's say. But that's what I said a year ago too. It'll be out this year, definitely. These things just take time, so I'm being patient. But yeah, that's a really exciting project too. Speaking of stories that almost didn't get saved, or her story is just so inspiring. She is, for people who don't know, you would probably be most likely to know Daisy Turner from maybe her appearance in Ken Burns' Civil War series. She appears in a couple places reciting poetry as basically an almost 100-year-old storyteller, interviewed by Jane Beck in the 1980s when she was 90-something. She was born in the 1880s, and her father... She was born in Vermont, and her father, Alec Turner, had been enslaved in Virginia before the Civil War. And his father had been enslaved and brought from Africa.
Wow. So
right there, her oral history, the stories that she told that were passed directly to her within a generation past her dad, reached all the way back to Africa. And she retains that oral history. And she would recite these stories and these poems and tell these amazing tales, as an old woman, at least. That's the transcripts and the work that we are working from in this book. So the book is a group of artists who are interpreting her stories, and they asked us which of her stories we'd be most interested in, and I gravitated towards her father's memories of the Civil War. Because and you can see a little of that artwork there. My piece of the story starts in 1865 at the very end of the Civil War. And she used the term Holocaust. It was like the end of the world. That's right. How he described it to her. And I think what caught my attention there is that Freeman Colby, in his letters back, is relatively upbeat considering the circumstances he's in. And he's writing back to his family, and this war means something. And do you think Lincoln will win the election? And we'll beat him. Don't you worry. He's being upbeat. Right. And that's kind of the story he tells about the war. It's a relatively upbeat story and a story of advancement. When Alec Turner told his kids, like his young daughters, about this war. Apparently he told it like it was the end of the world. To hear Daisy Turner tell it, like it was just a dog fight, dog knockdown, drag out, end of the world fight. Just and that's such a different telling of the same, like they were in almost the same place at the same time, right around Richmond and Petersburg at the end of the war. And they have such radically different tellings of it, and such radically different experiences of coming to New England after the Civil War. Freeman Colby comes home and comes back to his home here in town and is working on the school committee. And, you know, he returns to his family, and Daisy Turner's dad, that in that photo that you see there on the page you have there, he goes up to Maine. He works in the slate quarries, you know, and the stories of what it was like working in the slate quarries in Maine. That photo is Alec Turner. In some of my posts, I zoom in on that, and you can pick apart these photos and find all these details in their clothes and their body language. And other people have done a lot of work with those photos. But we have the stories, and we actually have some photos from family history to cartoon from. So I gravitated towards that telling of the end of the war and what he did after the war and how he ended up in the woods in Vermont, you know, coming up to work the lumber trade.
Right. So Dave McNally asked if I wanted to get copies of the Daisy Turner graphic novel, how would I go about getting some? I'd love to add these to our school.
Yeah, they should be. Thank you. Good question. They should be available for schools and libraries in Vermont. It'll be out through the Vermont Folklife Center, but definitely, David, if you want to follow me on social media or go to my site and sign up there, I'll be posting about that. We don't have a specific link yet, but we will soon.
Okay.
And I'm not the person to ask what it'll be.
So before we went on, so I had all kinds of tabs ready to talk about, but we've already hit our hour mark. So we'll have to get you back on again, and we can talk about your birds and talk about your comics workshop that we mentioned earlier as well, which has been extremely entertaining. So Marek, people can find you at marekbennett.com, and on there you have all of your work. You can check out your comics workshops on there. You do great virtual comic workshops as well. Is that still people can still ask about that as well?
Yeah. I'm staying virtual through this year. I haven't been vaccinated. I shouldn't be early on in the line. You know, I'm just going to wait my turn, and we can actually do a lot virtually. It's not the same as drawing together in the classroom.
Right.
But there's so much that, you know, all my projects I have right here at my desk. I can turn on the little desktop camera and we can draw together, and we're up close in some ways that you can't get when you're doing an assembly, you know,
right.
or a classroom visit. So I look forward to returning to schools, but for this year, I'm going to be all virtual still.
Right. It's weird because it's distance, it's virtual, but there's also the sense of intimacy. Like you said, you can, and your live stream drawings. I mean, and check out Marek's YouTube page as well, where he does these great live stream little workshops as well that have really taken off over the last few months as well, especially your library working. And you do something at least like every few days you're doing a live stream, correct?
Well, I decided this is my I don't know if it's a plan for increased sanity or decreased craziness, but I'm trying to do just a regular live draw at a regular time. So for this winter, it was all right. Mondays and Fridays we'll just go on and do Friday Doodle or Monday Monster and kind of build. Each one builds on what we've done already. Right. And then we circle back and practice the same techniques, but in a different context.
Right.
It's been a lot of fun. There's some school groups that join too, which is great because you get the pictures of the kids' artwork, and it's just so fun to see. And that's been so, I mean, we've all missed, you know, going to conventions, drawing with each other in the same room together.
Right.
And yeah, like you say, it's you can really feel a sense of intimacy when you're right there over someone's shoulder as they draw. So yeah, and I don't really announce those on social media. They pop up, but then I send out the invites through the Patreon.
Right.
The idea being like, hey folks, come on back here backstage. You get all the cool stuff and the scans and the printables and the invites.
And another reason why to subscribe to your Patreon. So yeah, that's good.
It's been a fun process. When I think of like the past year, the way I describe it is like I'm doing the same work I've always done, but it's like I'm doing it in a different country, because you just have to learn a totally different system of connecting and getting the work out there.
Right. Yeah.
So it's been a good year for learning, I guess.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Marek. And Matt, let's get you back on again. And we got plenty more things to talk about. So
yeah, thank you. Nice to talk with you again.
Yeah. So
look, no global crisis while we've been talking, or maybe I should check the news. This is good.
Just the same one going on.
Well, yeah, but now it's normal.
Yeah.
Now we're used to it. So, next.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Nice to talk with you. Thanks, everybody.
You know, I just found that out. I was looking up the roots of the word art, and inertia is actually, the root of that is the same Proto-Indo-European as art.
Really?
Yeah, it's like, because art originally meant like intention, you know, something artificial, something you make intentionally.
Right.
It doesn't just happen in nature. It's art. It's created by people. And something that's inert is like, has no intention in it. Was not made or created. It's just inert.
Really? Okay. Wow.
Yeah. I love that sense of like inert. It just sits there, but art is lively, has human creative intention to it.
Art has motion. It has like, direction and intent. Oh, that's really cool. Wow. Okay.
It does something. It moves you somehow. Yeah. But then you walk past like, something that is not art, and it just doesn't move you. It's inert.
Right. Wow. Okay. Wow. That's interesting. That's good. Now I have something to put at the end of at the end of our interview. Then I can add that little section. That's good.
Kids, stay tuned after the credits for a little bit of etymological fun.